Hey, so today I thought I would cover one topic. The main topic is I was looking through things to talk about, and something that comes up all the time over the course of our lives, and especially in the tech industry, is this concept of lock-in. And I guess I'll get to what lock-in is once I get to that, and then like I did back on Tuesday, maybe I'll do every time if I remember. I have three links I want to share at the end. But before we start, if you want to, what I'd recommend you do is you should go check out our free Kubernetes distro, the Tanzu Community Edition. Now, there's a lot more than just Kubernetes in there. It's actually, I don't know if we really articulate this very much, but it's actually an ongoing bundling of all the open source components that we build a lot of the new Tanzu stuff out of. There's lots of fun stuff in there to check out. But if you just go to tanzucommunityedition.io or just search for Tanzu Community Edition, you should go download that. And I'll put a link to it, not here in the stream chat, but in the archive. So first, I need some little stingers that are like, or something like that. That would be fun. But I was looking through some of my old, and by old I mean from last month maybe, comments to reporters, and those are always good. If you find yourself in the situation where you're answering questions from journalists or reporters or analysts, I recommend always writing them an email for one thing, if you can, and then reusing that content to post. It's always good. I used to do that at Red Monk all the time. In fact, if you're really interested, let me put a link to it, because who wouldn't want to read super old takes on enterprise technology stuff. Let me see if let's bring this up here. You can see my old. Whoa, that's the wrong screen. Oh, this thing. I'm gonna have to reconfigure a couple of things here. Let's turn off this screen. Sorry about this. It's embarrassing. Something happened with the OBS configuration. I don't know. This stuff's always fragile. But look, there's my old Red Monk blog. Isn't that exciting? I stopped working there, as you can see, in 2011. But I had let's see if it has tags here. I used to put all of on cloud.com. Remember them? I wonder what I wrote about them. But, yeah, it's just really a little brief thing there. But it's fun. Like, you would email these things. Fireside. Notice pulling in consumer tech. Whoa. Yep. Anyhow, one day, probably no day, this is like my grandpa would keep all of his papers, because he was actually working on like a little memoir towards the end there, printed out on those dot matrix printers. I wonder where that is. Hopefully my mom has that. That'd be fun to read through. Anyhow, I have one on lock-in that I wrote recently, and I thought I would kind of just go through a discussion of it, because it's a topic that comes up all the time. And so I'll define lock-in just briefly. And I don't know if you really need to follow along there. I can just do a big talking head today. So the objection to lock-in is often that, and first of all, I'm extremely biased because I work for a vendor that would love you to buy software and services from us. We want you to sell something, and often lock-in is a argument that people have against working with us instead of open source or doing their own thing or something that is more open, right? And especially if you're from a large existing vendor that's been around throughout, for several decades, people are always leery of locking into your platform. And I think what they mean by that, and this kind of gets to the understanding the nuance of it and thinking about it, is that essentially once you want to change the technology that you're using, that it's very hard, if not impossible. You can imagine, this term, it's a very descriptive term. You can imagine that if you've signed some contract for, I don't know, the type of shirts that you want to wear, and then all of a sudden you decide you want to change the shirts that you're wearing, but the person you signed the contract with was like, oh, no, you signed this contract. You can't leave. That's a really weird definition. But more practically, you can think about databases. Data is always a good illustrative form of lock-in. So if you are using like some sort of proprietary database that you can only buy from one vendor or only get from one vendor, and you decide you don't like that database or that formatting for reasons that I'll get into here, you are locked into it. It's hard to leave it. So first, especially nowadays in the cloud native, Kubernetes, software development, whatever world, and this was the case back in the 90s when I was a developer, in the 2000s as well. It's not like it's a new concern. But people are always very concerned of lock-in, and it comes up as an objection. Now, let me talk about, I think that, lock-in's a very real thing, but I think it's important to think about what are you worried about. Now, I listed just sort of like the ability to leave, but I think there's a few, maybe I will, let me see if I can increase the size here. Oh, I don't want to knock my coffee off. That'd be terrible. But let's kind of use my notes here. Is this going to work? Good old bear. Showing you the markdown. So now, this is not exhaustive. Hopefully not exhausting, but it's just a few things. So first, I think when people are worried about lock-in, and again, whether it's for data or the type of data center that they're using, the type of infrastructure, I should say, they're using, or also as I highlight here, working with outsourcers, right? You might be locked into a contract of like, we have a 5-year contract. People, maybe they still do, but they would also sign 10-year contracts back in the days of EDS and other people. Or your system integrator, the person who you're outsourcing all your programming to. You might be locked into a 5-10-year contract that you can only, not so much that you can only get services from them, but you're locked in by virtue of having spent tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars with that outsourcer. And now you don't have budget left to go to someone else to do outsource your development to. And you also, because of the nature of how most of these contracts are done, you agreed at the beginning about the way you're going to interact with them, that you would send requirements over, they would develop the software and give it to you. You kind of have this working arrangement that probably is state of the art the first year of your contract. But as you go into year 2 and 3, 4, 5, 10, like often, what I encounter a lot is that people are slowed down by the outsourcers that they're locked in. So it's probably a bad idea to have a long contract or to somehow write into the contract that you can completely redefine the working relationship, which is pretty much going to ruin the risk management and the profits of the outsourcer unless they're very savvy. So that's probably not something that you want to outsource so much. But to that point, that kind of covers all the bases of thinking in a more nuanced, complicated way about lock-in, in the sense that it's not just we're using this piece of technology and now we can't move from it. Like there's all sorts of types of lock-in. Let me get rid of this here to worry about, and thinking about other stuff you're locking in and kind of weighing if you should do that or not. But when it comes to software, the easiest thing to think about, I think that people want the opposite of lock-in is they want it to be fast to use technologies they have, right? So they don't want to have to, again, go through a ticket or necessarily like wait to upgrade a proprietary or any system that they're using, right? You can be locked into something by virtue of just like, you can't upgrade it, right? You can't get the new features. They also often, one of the reasons people think that they are locked into something is it's not easy enough to use, right? It's very difficult. There's a longer process to, spin up a database instance, or in kind of like a traditional on-premise way of doing infrastructure, something that people don't talk about very much, but that you hear about a lot is, well, that's contradictory, is just that it takes several weeks just to get a server, right? So you're kind of locked into that process. But I think the key thing that people want when they're discussing lock-in, and this is an important, to me, nuance, is they want portability, right? They want to be able to move their software, move their data to something different, right? They don't want it hidden or locked into that. And this is why data becomes such a big deal, is, you've got the old classic notion of data gravity, that even if your data is very open and it follows standards and you could just move it from one database or one whatever to another, there might just be so much of it that it would take a long time to move it. Or it might just be spread out over so many different sources that it's hard to centralize it somewhere. I don't know. There's that old saying that you should never, underestimate the speed and bandwidth of a station wagon with tape drives driving at 60 miles per hour down the highway. And I'm always curious, why there aren't more station wagons in data transfer, but that's fine. So those, I think, are things that people really want. That's the opposite of lock-in, is we want it to be pretty much easy to use a new technology, and we want portability for our applications and data layers, right? Like we want to put it another way, and this is something I think that way back in the 2000s, Simon Phipps came up with. You want the freedom to leave, right? That's a good way of summarizing it, is whether or not the stack that you're using is open source and completely open, or whatever, or it's more proprietary. You want to know that within a reasonable time frame, and that time frame could be days, weeks, months, I don't know, it just depends. You want it to be easy to essentially move to a different stack of technology. Now, this one way I think about this a lot is, even if you have a platform that has standard APIs, and this is kind of a data gravity concern here, but has standard APIs and is open and didn't seem like you had lock-in, it can often be effectively impossible to move from it. And I'll give you an example of that, and that is Flickr. So I started using Flickr. It's a photo uploading site. It's one of the, I think it's the first thing that, Stuart Butterfield and some other people, but he went on to do Slack, did. It's a photo sharing site. I know that sounds like a crazy thing nowadays that you would have a whole site to do that, but it was a big thing. And I started using that, I don't know, in the mid 2000s, and I have a lot of photos in there. Now, everyone makes a big deal that you can download photos from it, right? And you can, but the mechanism by which you do that is not done very well. And it's frustrating because a programmer could have just done it correctly. And, as I was joking yesterday, any good programming task only takes 15 minutes. I'm sure it would just take them 15 minutes to do this. But first you have to, if you imagine, like, I don't even know, let's estimate that it's 500 gigs of photos I've uploaded over 15 years to there. So first you've got to spin up a batch job, which is fine, right? Like, you can't just do that real time, I guess. But then you go to this site, and when I do it, there's basically 30 zip files that I can go download. That's fine. I can download 30 zip files, right? Just right click and queue them up and go eat a taco or something. But the real issue comes to how they create that data. And this is where the portability and the lock-in into Flickr is infuriating. So it downloads two things per picture. One, the original upload file, and they've renamed the file to their Flickr way of naming stuff, which is fine. And then there's a JSON file next to it that has all of the metadata, the tags, the description, the title, and crucially, the creation date of the photo. Because what happens is, for whatever reason, that photo that they download, the creation date is the date that you asked for the archive to be created. So if I uploaded a photo in 2004, right, that the file now has the date of 2020 in January. And sure, I have the JSON file there. But if, I don't want to futz around with a JSON file. If I don't want to futz around with it, when I import it into iPhotos, I'm going to have 15 years of photos that were uploaded on January 6, 2020, which is going to ruin everything, right? So consequently, now, I could go write a Python script or whatever to go open up each file individually and go in and write, change the date correctly, and even kind of go through the whatever metadata is embedded in a JPEG file nowadays and put that stuff in, and that would fix the problem. But why don't the programmers at Flickr just do that, right? Like, it's almost as if this is one of those situations where they didn't really think through the scenarios that people had and then kind of follow up with them. Now, there's also APIs that you can go to Flickr with, and there's even some tools. There's one called Bulkr, Bulkr, which of all things is an Adobe Air app from the RIA eras. And that one's fine. And that one connects to the APIs and downloads it one by one, and it has the right metadata. But essentially, it just takes so long that it doesn't work. So that's a very consumery example, but it goes to show that even if a service or vendor allows you to take your data, if you have data portability, you really have to investigate. It's not only about getting the data, but is it in a shape that allows you to easily move it to the new way you want to do things, right? So that's a concern of lock-in, is even if you have something that purports to be open, is it actually portable? Do you actually have this freedom to leave? I mean, I guess this is something beyond a freedom to leave that you need to pay attention to. And that kind of gets also to compatibility, right? So there are a lot of open systems that don't have lock-in. There's also a lot of proprietary ones that the format that they have, whether it's the binary formats of the software, the way you have to package up your applications to run, or the data formats, whatever, that are open, that nowadays are not really compatible with things, kind of like with the Flickr example, just because they're so obtuse and complex to use, right? So you could imagine that if you were a big service-oriented architecture or WS star sort of person, and you had converted, I don't know, 20, 30 years of like ERP info, of sales information into the XML files, like those are all, meticulously open formats, but they're in this weird XML format, probably weird to people nowadays, that will be very obtuse and hard to work with, right? So lock-in is not only a concern of getting the software that you're getting from a third party, but also how you are architecting and making your files open, and also, making sure that in the future you can do something with them. Which I think, the other way I wanted to round this out is to go over like some drivers. I mean, I've kind of mentioned them, but just to make it explicit, like what are reasons people worry about lock-in? Well, the first one is, I think, we should always take the following seriously, as much as we'll snicker about it, but it could just be an undesirable technology. It might work perfectly well, right? But the developers or the sysadmins or whoever using it just don't want to use it anymore. It's just too ancient. Like, XML is kind of fine, right? And but people use JSON instead, and JSON is probably fine, but people use YAML instead, and whatever comes after YAML's probably fine, and then people just don't want to use it, right? They want to do something new. And this is often a huge reason of worrying. Something that makes people discover lock-in is they want to use a new technology, and they realize that the one that they're currently using just is very hard to update, very hard to move their applications from. They're locked into it, right? And I think in the Kubernetes world, like what's important to start thinking about when it comes to this, well, not this, but kind of portability, like you want to move to a new way of doing things, is to think about how am I packaging up the software in a way that is going to be, like if I specify what the software looks like, what the layout you're going to have, I always forget what you call this in Kubernetes. Anyways, the manifest, the thing that you're going to deploy it to, it's good to not get too specialized in there so that you can try out new ways of doing things. Because again, doing things in Kubernetes is extremely early on, despite the fame that it has. So you want to give yourself a lot of optionality in the future of how you might start using new platforms, or platform's the wrong word, but new ways of deploying and running your software. So another reason that people get concerned about lock-in is just features, right? So whatever system you're using, it just doesn't support new ways of doing things that you want, right? And this often comes up, in a security context is good, right? So like, we had the old log4j problem over the holiday there. And some people were able to very quickly update the versions of Java and log4j and all the dependencies that they were using. Like there was Jürgen from Datev, a big German, they're kind of like the Intuit sort of Germany. They do a lot of accounting software. And he noted that since they use Cloud Foundry, the Tanzu application service, they were able to go through and just basically tell Cloud Foundry to update all the Java versions and the libraries and the dependencies and rebuild all of the applications without having to go visit to do that. And, there's other ways of going and automatically updating things as well. Now, that kind of feature is not always available, depending on what you're using. So you might realize that security is a driver for avoiding lock-in and changing the way you're doing things. Now, it might also be you have ERP systems that you need to integrate with to show new catalogs in your website or your app, right? Like you might remember a story from Daimler that I have where the people who were selling cars wanted to also allow people to search for Sprinter vans, which was in a different ERP system. So they had to somehow interface with that. Now, I'm not saying in that case that they had a lock-in concern, but you can see that in scenarios like that, like let's go into the domain of plumbing supply, plastic nozzles and pipes, good old Macmillan piping. And it may be that you have separate systems that you're not only your data, but the processes for finding and acquiring and then also kicking off the manufacturing of specialized parts for your nozzles and your pipes. They might just not have features that you want. Like you might want to have more real-time querying of that, and maybe you can only do batch querying. So you have a 24-hour window to submit a job. To submit a job for creating a custom nozzle, just because that's the way your ERP system works, and so forth and so on. I think we saw this a lot back in the late 2000s when mobile apps came in, where, and you still see this a lot nowadays, where you can, especially with life insurance companies, I've found, and also health insurance companies, where you have to file reimbursements. You can tell they are locked in, or they just willingly don't want to change it. But whatever systems they're using to do their websites often look ancient and are really annoying to use. And sometimes, oddly enough, it's easier to use their mobile app, because I guess they've just abandoned the web app. But you can experience these things where, like, clearly the features in the stacks they're using aren't being upgraded for whatever reason. So that can be a driver to worry about lock-in, right? Like, we would like to use these new features. We want to integrate with the old ERP system for our nozzle custom making system, or we would really like to improve the web application or even the mobile application for filing insurance reimbursements, but we're just locked into this platform that we have. So another reason, and this drives a lot of the scenarios I was just talking about, is that your old technology might be a black box. People just may not know how it works. And this, again, covers the board of, you may not really know how you're packaging and running your software in production. Like, you might be scared to touch something and deploy a new feature because you don't know what you're going to break. You don't know the dependencies. And this, that can drive you to think oh man, we're stuck here. We've locked ourselves in through forgetting, if you will, how things work. And we haven't maintained skills in that, or we haven't maintained documenting how we are running things and the dependencies. And this can also be, like I was talking about that Bulker example, like maybe your application is an Adobe Air app, the desktop rich internet application app, and no one really knows how to program that anymore. Support's been dropped for it, so it's just become you're locked into a thing you don't understand and don't know how to use. So that might also make you discover lock-in and start being concerned about it. And then finally, and to some extent, especially when you're talking with the vendor, again, where I work, because a vendor wants you to give them money for something. We're not a nonprofit. But price is another. This is, ultimately a lot of discussions that a vendor has with someone. You could really probably save several weeks, if not months, by just saying hey, we love what you have. Can you just give it to us for cheaper? That's kind of but people need to build up cases on the vendor side and the buying side, kind of dueling. Us vendors will like to show you how actually the price that we want you to pay for something, you're going to have a great return on investment for it because of all these other things you're not considering. And then the on the buy side, they want to say no, we're not considering those things for ROI. You just cost too much based on whatever argumentation and proof points that we have. There's a lot of time spent on pricing in enterprise software, which is, I was getting my booster shot the other day. I don't know what you call this thing, but I went very early in the morning here. It was the Amsterdam Convention Center. And, you go in. It's a very efficiently, except for what I'm about to say, efficiently run system, very quick. But there's a certain part where you enter the area where you're going to get your shot. And there were 8 switchback lanes that were, I don't even know how long. Longer than, they were about as big as a gas station parking lot. That's kind of a weird thing to reference, but they were very long. And so by switchback, I mean you would go down like this, you'd go this way, and you go this way, and like an airport. And there weren't that many people there. And all of us people, including me, even though you kind of walked in and the door was right there, but you had to go through these switchbacks like this to finally get to the door. And instead of someone going up to the one attendant and being why are we going through these switchbacks when there's 20 of us and we could just queue up here at the door and go in there, all of us just went through the switchbacks because it's just sort of I don't know, we didn't want to put in the effort to change something that we all knew was absurd and stupid. And that's kind of what it comes to when you with a lot of enterprise pricing and price negotiation sales. It's everyone involved knows that it's pretty much absurd, inefficient, and stupid. But no one wants to be the one to, as they say, lie on the tracks and perhaps die on the tracks to fix it. But that's something that drives lock-in concerns. And I think probably the easiest thing that people voice lock into is to say like, oh, well, we're going to lock into future costs on things, right? So if we use your technology, it's there in the future, there will be things that are cheaper for us to use, or we could just use something for free. And then we're just going to end up, you're just doing rent seeking. And I don't really know what that means, but we're locked into paying you too much money, and we don't have a lot of control and flexibility to bring down costs in the future. Cost is like a great driver for all sorts of things when it comes to thinking through what you're going to be using. So, and then what do we have? Yeah. So, I mean, I think the main emphasis there is to think when it comes to lock-in, like think way beyond just like, I'm selecting a technology to use, and am I committing too much, and is it going to be hard for me to move from that technology? And the other thing to consider is benefits that you get, right? Like you have to make you're always locking into something, right? Even if you use an open technology, like the SOA stuff I was talking about, you're locking yourself into, if you want to leave it, you're going to have to recode things, you're going to have to reformat your data. So I would pick, it's almost like pick something that doesn't have lock-in. And compare that you think doesn't have lock-in, and think about how easy would it be to leave from that? How portable is it? And that's a good standard. And I wouldn't so much use a phrase like lock-in, because again, everything has lock-in, but think about freedom to leave, portability, things like that, and maybe cost as well. Cost is always a weird thing because it assumes you're going to be in the same situation, using the same technology stack, having the same needs, 3 to 5 years in the future when you're worried about cost. And chances are things will be changing. It's sort of like laptops, right? Like, or computers. Like we somehow, once we got past the 90s and the early 2000s when computers were actually very expensive, we somehow have leveled out that basically any given computer you're going to buy in a year is more or less the same price. If you're buying a PC, what's it going to be? Like $600, $800? If you're buying a Mac, you're probably going to spend $900 to $2,000 depending on your profile, right? And that price tends to remain the same, even though it always is getting faster and better. So, if you just start negotiating, thinking about lowering price all the time, you're not... my whole point is you're probably going to want to be spending money on things as they change. So don't assume that you should be lowering your spending all the time. So that's some consideration to think about when it comes to lock-in. And it's not to say that lock-in is fake. It's just like have some knowledge about what you're thinking through, and don't just use lock-in as one easy excuse. Really do some analysis on that and think through it. Maybe if you're working with a vendor and they're trying to negotiate on price, you can understand how they're coming up with all these other considerations to tell you that they're actually cheap and not expensive. You can tell I have a lot of snarky thoughts on that. So now let's look at, let me space this out so that we don't, in fact, what I will do, let's open this up. Let's look at the 3 links that I wanted to go over. Let's see if Bear is smart enough to do the right thing. Yeah, I think it figured it out. Let me open these links up. It's actually a sunny day here in Douwendrecht, Amsterdam. It's very nice. So I won't go into detail on all of these, but I think they are your 3 links to consider on this Thursday in this episode. So first, let me put this in the chat here, and I'll put it down below if you're watching the archive. So here's a whoa, computer's being a little weird. Here's a post from Charles Fitzgerald. Now, I didn't actually track down, which you would think if I was to talk about this, I would do this. But apparently he's been having some sort of spat with some people who are coming up. What is the old computer doing? Who are proposing this idea of a super cloud. And I would suggest it's fun to read through this because there's a lot of detailed thinking about 2 concepts. And that concept is what is Chrome doing? Speaking of what, let me just do a double check here. Okay, so that's all cool. Pause that. I'm not sure why it's bugging out. Anyways, so I don't know. Obviously, he's trying to say the super cloud concept is bogus, and I haven't read the source materials, so I don't know. But to hear him describe it, essentially what he's doing, someone has come up with some new notion of supercloud, which, as he maps to, is basically it's basically a multi-cloud platform as a service. And he brings up the good point that, Cloud Foundry and OpenShift have worked on this for about a decade or so. And it's a lot of the work that you see going on in Kubernetes nowadays, right? Like supporting running on multiple clouds, and indeed also using services for multiple of them, which is, that's a very difficult problem to solve at scale, which is to say in a generalized way that multiple people can use. But hopefully we'll figure that out at some point. I think, that's where there's a lot of, if you look at things like, Backstage, the open source thing from Spotify about creating developer portals and stuff like that, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. I think I just said a bunch of gobbledygook. But I think you should check out this post, because he goes over a lot of what the requirements are, the explanation is for what multi-cloud means, more or less at an infrastructure level, but what multi-cloud means at a custom application to developer layer. And, I'm always bemoaning that the term PaaS has fallen out of favor of use. But he all but makes the case that when we say multi-cloud for software developers, what we're really saying is platform as a service, a platform as a service that can run on multiple clouds, which I think is an interesting concept to sort out. Now, the next one that I want to go over is, if you remember last episode, I went over this piece that was saying, suggesting an evolution of OKRs, something with gyms, and kind of criticizing OKRs for not outlining how to actually address the goals that you have. So I went through and I thought I would read up on what OKRs actually are. And somehow I came across this paper, How to Leverage OKRs If Your Company Is Not Google, which is fun. Let me actually open up the PDF that I downloaded and highlighted, because I think this is worth reading through. It's actually a good summary. I didn't put the Charles Fitzgerald thing in here. Let me put the correct link down there. And then if you're following along here in the stream, I'll put it down here. And obviously I will put it down in the YouTube archive. But I think if you're interested in OKRs, or you just want a refresher, I think this is a pretty good read. It's kind of like, that book on OKRs that came out a couple years ago. It could be reduced to a 7-page paper, which I think is described here. So let's look at it, right? So the main thing that it lays out in defining OKRs, right? Objectives and key results. It's kind of right there, is that you define what we would call in the jargony world, a business value, a business outcome, the objective that you have. And then you define what would a numeric result be if we are successful at this, right? And also, what result do we want, and therefore, what result do we want to target? Now, before I move on, let's look at where is an example of it, because that kind of thing, I thought there was some good examples in here somewhere. There we go. So, well, it's right there. I should have just looked. So you could, and what's interesting about OKRs is that you can have it be this kind of vague, not touchy-feely, but this vague notion here. This is not maybe the best example, but whatever. So you can say, we want to have good customer experience, which actually, if you look at surveys, is what a lot of people want to do. Now, what they also mean is we want good customer experience because we believe that will result in, the 3 things that every business wants: new customers with new revenue, keeping existing customers and expanding the revenue that you get from them, and lowering cost or hiring prices or increasing profits, right? That's pretty much the only 3 things that a for-profit company wants to do. But so you define that as a goal, and then you can go over, these are like the numeric results, the things you target, right? So you can see improving NPS from this level to that level, and then here you go, repurchase rate, right? Like, we'll assume we have good customer experience if repurchase rate is done, and then acquiring customers will be that, right? So very, very specific numeric things to target. Now, hopefully, let me see if there's better examples, because those are like, and it's almost too much of a straw man for what the article yesterday was going over. Let's see. Yeah. Anyways, so the article we looked at yesterday about gyms, like I think is a good objection to this is sort of like, yeah, but how are we going to achieve that, right? And if you remember what the framework, I think her name was Kathy, was putting forward, is that what you should put in the defining of these goals are some ideas of how you're going to achieve that, right? Like, what are you going to do? What is an experiment that you can run to actually get to that point? And there's a lot of I don't know, there's a lot of nuance, to use that word, between like defining a goal and telling people how to go about doing things. But the important part of those experiments is to have a very short cycle and a very short feedback window to kind of plan out how you're going to achieve those things, and not just kind of toss out OKRs to people. I don't know. It's a little unfair because, like, of course you're going to be doing experiments, I hope. But the other part that I think is kind of different about OKR thinking than at least when I've done corporate goal planning in the past is you have, where does he, I'm sure, is that a lot of them come from the bottom, right? Like this person says 60%, but a lot of these OKRs, rather than kind of cascading and fitting into higher level things, like they can also originate from the bottom stack. There's another thing that I think is interesting to look over, that I think there's two things, or did I highlight three? I want to just highlight three things that, you should go check this out and think about it. It's good to have, part of the value of doing this kind of system, of having the two parts to it, is that it allows you to have kind of vague outcome-based things, right? Like, we don't want an outcome to be that we have updated our version of Java, or we have increased our trucking capacity to like 30%, right? Like, that is like a key result that you would have, not a goal necessarily, but you want to say that, we want to be able to deliver packages to people on a 24-hour cycle instead of a 72-hour cycle, right? And therefore, we'll know that we can do this when we have more capacity. So I think it's interesting to think about, when you're putting together your goals, to think about the outcome that you want. What's the thing business-wise that you want to achieve? And then this is something that, like, one of those things, and like, here's a new, better way of doing things that, like, I'm sure a few people do, but like it's completely impractical for just like normals, is this idea of transparency, right? Which is to say that within the confines of your company, everyone knows each other's OKRs. Now, the primary thing here is just like, people just don't like sharing things. Like, I mean, and as example of that, there's a lot of work going on to make sure that people are paid equally and fairly. And yet, I don't know if I've ever encountered somewhere where everyone's salary is just public knowledge in a company. And everyone would be like, whoa, but like, there are certain lines of secrecy that people just won't cross. And a lot of them come down to sharing how individuals are rated, and also how individuals are compensated. And this is kind of like my rant about enterprise pricing. I have a feeling that if we made that those two things completely transparent, especially the pay, we'd probably solve a lot of problems very quickly, if not kind of brutally. But what do I know? I'm only an individual contributor. And the next one, the last thing to put on is, of course, anytime that you measure something, people are going to figure out how to game it, right? Which is not an excuse to not do it. It just means that you need to really think through how you avoid people gaming the system, or that how, in setting up an OKR, you're really limiting yourself or any goal to, I don't know, being stuck. And I think an important part of that is, initially, and this gets covered somewhere here, and it's also part of the thing we were going over yesterday, but initially, what becomes really important is to realize you probably want to set these on a time horizon of like 3 months, right? If not shorter, so that you're constantly learning how to do them, but you're also learning how to calibrate on them, and kind of like, I don't know, just learning if they're good or not, and how you would track things. So that's an extremely important thing, is to think about the feedback loop for these goals, which is going to be very troublesome if you're converting to this, because you're probably on annual goals that tie up to funding and all sorts of things like that. Like, I remember, whenever I look at the annual goals that I set a year ago, they're just like, kind of don't apply to anything that's happened over the past year. The past 3 to 4 years or so of, as at Pivotal and VMware, things have changed so much in the market, and therefore what we do, and through acquisitions, that what I would have planned for and done at the beginning of the year. I mean, not to mention COVID, just completely didn't make sense. And then we would discover more valuable things for me to do, so I would shift to that. And I don't know, it's better to have kind of updating the goals that you have. So, I have to admit that I don't know if I've ever lived under or operated under OKRs. I tried to at some point, but I stopped. So then finally, so you might remember Rita. She had a blog post from last month going over the open source components in I don't know what I'm going to think about as VMware's developer stack. I'm just going to start calling it that. And it's the stack of stuff that we have. It's in the Tanzu application platform, but it's also like just in the Tanzu Kubernetes edition. This stack that we have, in the same way that if you were to say like Amazon has a stack or Microsoft has a stack, there's a whole bunch of different things in there that you can mix and match or use. It's not just like it's not as like clearly delineated as like a Rails. I mean, even in the Rails world, I'm a very old person. Developer-wise, so I'm referencing old things. But even a given stack has all exceptions to it. But essentially, that's what we're working on, is the developer stack, both the technologies that developers use and also all the tools around it when they want to write applications to run on Kubernetes and have them be cloud-native applications, kind of microservices-driven, just the way you would do applications nowadays. Anyways, so she gives a very brief overview of the open source stuff that's in the developer stack. Now, again, I think I mentioned this, but this is something that hopefully we'll articulate a lot more in the next year. But this developer stack that we're building in VMware is pretty much open source based, right? A lot of it's built on open source projects that either we work on or that, we pull in, and we're assembling together a developer stack from a whole bunch of open source things and a few proprietary things here and there, right? Like you can run it all on vSphere, not open source, and on the software-defined networking stuff that we have. But it's a good overview of the open source stuff that we have and some links to it. So you should check that out. And you can start to get an idea of what I keep saying is that we're building an open source stack based on open source components and working on the open source projects and components that we have, which going to the lock-in thing means that, you don't necessarily have to go all the way to the commercial option. You can start poking at the things that we have here. And if you decide you don't like this stack, you can use different components. You could just move off of these things. I don't know, or not, whatever. But it's as open as you can more or less get with this stuff. We're just trying to integrate everything together. Well, that's it for today. As always, this has been Tanzu Talk. I try to do one of these every Tuesday and Thursday in a European-friendly time. If you want to get the archives for this show, you can go to tanzutalk.com and go to videos, and you can find a playlist right there that will list all of the material that we have. And I'll put links down below to the things that I mentioned. It'd be great to hear what y'all thought about it. And also, as a reminder, if you really want to start delving into this idea of the developer stack that we have, what you should do is go to Tanzu community, I can't spell, edition.io. Did I spell that right? Boom. And you can download basically the stack that we have, our developer stack. We may not have all the components in there at the moment, but I think it's going to be the center of essentially the stack that we have for developers and operations people who want to run things in a cloud way. I'll put it here in the chat. Y'all should check out that. And with that, as I like to say, we'll see everyone next time.